So we have a conclusion to Global War 36. So this is the end of my second game. And for the second game, the Axis have emerged victorious. I believe in the first game, the Comintern came in second place, whereas in this case, the Allies did. But it was still a massive Axis victory. The victory points broke down to 18 for the Axis, 7 for the Allies, and 6 for the Comintern. So the game ends after 20 turns in January 46. I rolled a 4 for the variable ending, and I needed a 1 through a 7. So the game has ended. If it would have went on for even a couple more turns, there really wouldn't have been any change. As a matter of fact, at least on the European side of the map, all the way to really the Far East, the Axis were looking to make even more gains, honestly, if the game was to continue. So first with Germany on the final round of the game, they had started moving into Spain. So they moved a huge stack of mechs into this southern French territory, just one step away from Spain, and they moved a stack of about 8 medium armor down into Spain itself. So Germany was looking to get into Spain and eject the United States off of Spanish territory once and for all. So the U.S. was really getting kind of boxed in down in Spain. The Germans also built another paratrooper. So they had 3 paratroopers with the 3 transports ready to possibly land somewhere in England. They also bought 10 subs they put down. And on the production chart, they put down all warships. So they had spent their entire income this turn on building up a navy. So it was going to be probably just a matter of a couple of turns when Germany would have had the forces built up to invade England itself. They put down, I believe, 3 fleet carriers in position 1 on the production chart. And then because of improved construction, they can go ahead and complete 2 turns of the production phase in 1 turn. So they went ahead and put down 3 battleships, I believe 3 heavy cruisers and 3 light cruisers, all were on the production chart 1 step away from completion. So they would have been finished off this turn coming up here. So the Germans were definitely building up a navy to not only sweep out any Allied ships left in the Atlantic, but also to go ahead and, again, look to land somewhere on the British home island. Over in the Far East, the Germans had moved up to within 1 territory adjacent to Novosibirsk, which is the relocated Russian capital. So the Russians, seeing this, decided to come on out. Instead of waiting for the inevitable German assault, they came out and attacked this adjacent territory, and they lost pretty bad. They ended up losing, I think, 2 mechs and about 6 infantry, and they inflicted like 4 or 5 casualties altogether. The Germans lost a couple cavalry and artillery, a light armor, and then the Italian motorized infantry also died. So the Germans were definitely going to take Novosibirsk this turn. They would have been able to attack with these couple of medium armor up here, a stack of 6 medium armor down here, a light armor, 2 fighters, 6 tacticals, and 5 infantry. And all the Russians had left were 2 heavy armor, 2 medium armor, 2 mechanized infantry, 2 fighters, and 3 infantry. So unless Germany had extremely bad die rolls, the second Russian capital was going to fall this turn. So that would have, and those are the only Russian units left on the board besides a few naval units in the Baltic. So the Russians would have pretty much been all but entirely wiped out of the game this next turn. And then with the fall of Novosibirsk, that would have opened up the remaining Russian territories that have an IPP value here in the Far East, as well as the Germans would have even been able to start coming into Mongolia and into China, communist China, and applying some pressure there, which of course would have helped out their Japanese allies. So Germany was still making all kinds of moves here on this last turn. They were up to $101 plus bonuses, so a ridiculous amount of money each turn. There was no way the Allies were going to land back in Western Europe in any kind of force. Britain was pretty much purely on the defensive. They moved their fleet around here over by Ireland just because they didn't want to come down into the English Channel, because the Germans, again, put down 10 subs this last turn. Plus, the Germans also have a stack of about 8 fighters in Paris. So the British were really just trying to maneuver this fleet out of range of those German subs. They built men that they put in London. They also put some men up here in this northern British territory. They moved all their fighters down to London. So London's fairly well defended for the time being. About a half a dozen fighters, a tactical, and about a dozen infantry. But the British are collecting, even with bonuses, less than $20 a turn. So they were not going to be able to keep pace anywhere near with what the Germans were going to be putting on the board each turn. So I figured it would probably, again, be maybe a matter of 2 more turns. And if not London itself under assault, at least some of these northern British territories would have fallen. And then it would have just been a matter of time before London itself would have went down. As far as the U.S., they fought back a little bit in Spain. The Italians had come over. Italy wanted to kind of protect Gibraltar, knowing the game could end at any turn, and that's one of the victory points for the Italians. So they came over and took this Spanish territory adjacent to Portugal off of the U.S., but then the U.S. counterattacked on their portion of the turn, took that back. But in Spain itself, the U.S. is down to 3 territories with an infantry apiece, and then 4 fighters in Portugal. So Patton doesn't have much left in Spain, definitely nowhere near enough to withstand all this German armor and mechs that are coming down. The U.S. did come over, pick up these infantry out of New York, and are starting to make their way back. So they would have been able to land in Spain this next turn, but it's only a half a dozen infantry, so they're not going to do a whole heck of a lot. As far as the Italians, again, like I said, they had brought their entire fleet outside of Rome over here, landed and attacked in Spain itself, were counterattacked. Now they're down to just 1 artillery left in Spain, and they have no ground units to bring over. But again, the Germans are coming down here, so Italy doesn't really have much to worry about in terms of losing Gibraltar. The Germans would have made it down here, if not in time. Gibraltar would have been maybe lost for like 1 turn, and that's it. The Italians also finished off a bunch more ships, another fleet carrier and a battleship, and 3 more destroyers. So as you can see, the Italians got quite the fleet in the Mediterranean. They also probably would have ventured out into the Atlantic this next turn, and combined with the German naval units that are going to be put down in the Baltic each turn, they would have that would have been more than enough to take on the British and American naval units that are in the Atlantic. So you could even actually see, if the game was somehow to last, another 4 turns. I think the maximum is out to 24 turns. You could have possibly even seen, although it seems unlikely, that the United States itself would have been in danger between the Germans and the Italians. In Africa, Japan took this cavalry, moved up to a couple of empty territories off of the French. Weren't worth anything, but as you can see, all of Africa pretty much is under Axis control between Vichy, Italy, and the Japanese. In the Pacific, this is really the only spot where the Axis are running into some trouble. Although, again, I actually think that if the game would have went on a couple more turns, Japan, with German assistance coming from outside of Novosibirsk, I think the Japanese would have been able to actually kind of turn the tide a little bit. So the Japanese built a bunch of infantry they put down in Tokyo along with a couple of fighters. They brought a stack of infantry on these transports down, and they landed in Hong Kong, took that back from the CCP along with Kwangtung. So that was worth $4 between those two territories and another victory point for Hong Kong. They also came down, brought down their light carriers, flew the planes off of the light carriers along with a couple of subs they had here in Sea Zone 134, and they were able to do naval combat in Sea Zones 132 and 133, and they took out all the Australian ships there. So they did lose their 2 subs, no planes in the process, but they took out altogether 2 destroyers, 2 transports, and a cruiser. And the main thing with that was taking care of the transports so that Australia wouldn't be able to continue to move men around to take any more the Money Islands back. So the Japanese were able to strand these Australian infantry on these 2 Money Islands. They also built a fighter and 3 infantry in Calcutta. They moved a fighter from Africa down here into South India. And they've got another light carrier with a fighter and some transports outside of Calcutta itself. So Japan, the main thing was taking a couple territories back on the Chinese mainland and taking out the Australian transports down in the South Pacific. But other than that, Japan, again, was losing some territory. The CCP came up and took this Manchurian territory off of the Japanese. So really, they've got 3 infantry, 3 cavalry, and 3 artillery. So they were about to eject Japan entirely out of Manchuria itself. They would have been able to take those last couple of Japanese territories here if the game was to continue. They also, down in Southeast Asia and into India, they actually started to coming into India itself. They took Siam, and they were 1 territory away from taking British Malaya. So that probably would have fallen here on this next turn because the CCP goes before Japan. But they would have only been able to move down with a single infantry. So Japan, with all these transports and men in Southeast Asia, would have been able to take it back. So it would have just been a temporary loss. But the CCP does have a stack of 5 cavalry in India, along with their 3 fighters. They also dropped down 7 infantry and spread them out on the coast here. They wanted to beef up those defenses in case the Japanese were to come over with the transports they had outside of Tokyo, which Japan did. The CCP couldn't guard every coastal territory, so they did end up losing Kwangtung and Hong Kong. But the rest of the coast is pretty well defended for the time being. As far as Australia, they built up a couple of destroyers, then moved a cruiser and a sub back outside of Sydney. So it would have taken them a couple of turns before they bought some more transports to move some men around. So they would have probably kind of just been confined to building units for the next couple of turns until they could put some transports on the board. So Australia wouldn't have really been much of a factor for several turns. They did fly a fighter to each of the 2 Money Islands that they owned. So there's a fighter and 2 infantry on each of those. But Japan probably would have been able to take them back with all the units they have that they can load onto these transports and move around. As far as the U.S., they moved the fleet that they had outside of San Francisco up here. So that's in the Central Pacific, definitely within range of pretty much going anywhere they want. So whatever direction these Japanese naval units went on their portion of the next turn, the U.S. would have probably been in striking distance. They've got 3 light cruisers, 3 heavy cruisers, 3 destroyers, 2 fleet carriers, 3 fighters, and a tactical bomber in that fleet. So Japan would have probably, and the Japanese definitely don't have the naval units to withstand an assault from this U.S. fleet. So Japan probably would have only been able to use these transports just for this next turn, and then they would have probably been destroyed by the U.S. So that would have definitely been a big boost to the United States. They also dropped down 3 battleships and 2 light carriers with a couple of tacticals off of San Francisco. So the U.S. definitely was in position to really take complete control of the Pacific, at least in terms of the naval war. Japan didn't even bother buying any ships this last turn, just because the U.S. already had a pretty big advantage in terms of the naval units they already had on the board this turn. So Japan figured they would have just been destroyed anyway. So they kind of relinquished control of the Pacific to the U.S. But again, Japan itself, Tokyo, wasn't in any danger of being invaded. And with the Germans finishing off the Russians this next turn and then being able to come down into China and Mongolia, the CCP would have definitely been feeling the crunch there. So that would have relieved some pressure from Japan. I think Japan would have then started really taking back and gaining control of the territories in Southeast Asia. They got the 2 minor complexes in Calcutta that can produce 4 units a turn. So I think Japan, again, even though they would have been at a naval disadvantage, I think on the Asian mainland, with the help of the Germans, they would have been able to gain some ground on the CCP. So that's how things look. After turn number 20, January 46, another Axis victory. I think this one was a little bit more pronounced than the first game, actually. Italy was fairly strong in both games, but I don't believe the Axis had as complete control of Africa in the first game. And the Germans were strong, very strong in both games, but they definitely weren't all the way to the doorstep of Novosibirsk in game number 1. So the Germans had made even more gains. And even the Japanese, who don't seem to be that strong if you look at the Pacific, they actually did a little bit better than in game number 1. In game number 1, they didn't have any of the Allied powers in the Pacific eliminated, and Japan was really kind of pushed back just into the Japanese home islands with a few territories they owned in China and a few of the Money Islands. Whereas in this game, they completely took out the CCP, or excuse me, the FEC. They completely took out the Far East Command, so they have Calcutta. And even though in terms of naval units, they're not strong at all, I think that they would, again, have been able to start pushing back on the CCP. So Japan definitely, I think at this point, is the weakest of the Axis powers, but still did a little bit better than in the first game. As far as the Russians go, the Comintern across the board, the CCP is really strong. So for the second game in a row, not only did the CCP win the Chinese Civil War, but they really kind of, once that ball gets rolling for them, not only do they kind of roll over the nationalist Chinese forces, but if they're kind of left unchecked, they can really give Japan a bunch of headaches. And if you look here in China, there's a lot of CCP markers on the board, including several original Japanese territories that are under CCP control. And I think at one point they were up to collecting $22 minus bonuses. So for a country that starts kind of backwards at the beginning of the game and collecting $2 a turn, to be up to $22 was pretty significant for them. The only problem is the Russians didn't hold up their end of the Comintern alliance. So the CCP would have been feeling the heat from the Germans once Novosibirsk fell. If the Russians would have kind of been able to hold up their end, that would have allowed the CCP to kind of focus just on Japan without Japan getting any assistance from Germany down the road. And that would have made the CCP even stronger. As far as the Russians go, they had some bad rolls here and there. I think in the battle for Moscow, for instance, the die roll really went against the Russians. I'm not sure what the answer is as far as a successful Russian defense. They went into Finland again. They took the Polish territories and the Baltic states that they're allowed to under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were convoying the Germans in the Baltic, so they were taking a few dollars off of Germany per turn there. But again, once the Germany invaded Russia, it was kind of just like a steamroller. It took a few turns, obviously, to get to the doorstep of Moscow, but the Russians counterattacked here and there, so a little bit of a back and forth, but they really didn't significantly hinder Germany once Germany declared war on the Soviet Union. As far as the Allies go, there was some success once the U.S. entered. The British had trouble. They lost basically all of Africa, or were losing significant portions of Africa fairly early on once Italy entered the conflict. But the U.S. was successfully pushing back. Again, for a while there, the Allies had pretty much all of Spain, and they even had several territories in France itself. They had a pretty good buildup in southern France there. So it was a little bit of, getting back into Western Europe too late, because by then Germany was so deep into Russia that they could then transfer most of their resources to defending Western Europe. And Germany just had so many units. Western Germany itself, they were pumping all kinds of infantry and mechs into Western Germany, so there was really no chance of the Allies landing there. And even in France, it was kind of a stalemate once the Allies landed in France itself. They couldn't. They just didn't have the juice to take Paris itself. So Germany kind of just boxed them in, and each turn Germany just kept getting stronger and stronger. Devoting more and more resources to Western Europe, and it was just a matter of time before the Allies got pushed back. The British did make an attempt, landed in northern Russia, but it was definitely too late there. Maybe a mistake that the British didn't devote more resources to trying to land into Russia earlier and helping the Russians out. But once the Germans took France and Poland, the British were by themselves for several turns, and Italy actually entered the game earlier than in game number 1. So the British had their hands full just kind of trying to defend Africa and the Mediterranean from Italy. So I think that was a significant advantage for the Axis, that they isolated the British for several turns before the U.S. Came into the war and before Germany attacked Russia. So with Britain kind of standing alone, they couldn't really build up the resources to aid Russia. They just had to concentrate on trying to defend the Mediterranean from the Italians. So that once Germany did invade Russia, Britain was kind of just holding on themselves and trying to defend their own territories in Africa, and just didn't have the resources to devote to the Soviet Union. The U.S., I thought they followed a pretty decent strategy. Again, they've got Japan fairly isolated, especially again in terms of the naval, the scales of the naval forces in the Pacific. And the U.S. was shuttling units back and forth from the east coast of the United States into Spain and France. But the U.S. was kind of reactionary in this game. It's like, 1 or 2 turns, they would devote most of their resources onto the European side of the map, trying to combat German and Italian aggression. And then that would allow Japan to, get a little bit more aggressive and take some new territories here and there. So then the U.S. would switch to devoting most of their resources to the Pacific. And they just couldn't ever completely catch up on either side of the map, just because the Axis had such a head start. So that is how things look after the second game. I'm going to be tearing this game down here later today and getting it set up again, because I'm going to be playing a YouTube War of Global 36, version 3, with a couple of guys here on YouTube. So we'll see how that goes. I'm excited for that. I'm sure there will be a lot of errors made on my part, and it'll definitely be a learning experience. I am going to take on the role of the Axis, so I will be Germany, Japan, and Italy. And then one of my opponents will have the Allied Alliance, and the other one will have the Comintern. So we'll see you guys here in a little bit. Again, I'm going to tear this game down, get it set back up, and then the YouTube War, which we're calling Live and Let Die, that will kick off on Wednesday, I believe, the 21st. So I'm going to go ahead and do a video either tomorrow or Wednesday before we kick the game off, and just kind of an introductory video to the upcoming game. I'm not going to go, obviously, into great detail in terms of, the strategy I want to pursue, just because I don't want to give away anything, but just maybe kind of a little bit of an overview and just in a generic sense, what I hope to accomplish with the Axis in our Live and Let Die game. So we'll see you guys in a couple of days. Take care.